Considered by many as one of the greatest F1 drivers in history, throughout his career he overcame all odds and escaped death to become a triple world champion. He is remembered as one of the most determined figures in all of motorsport, who raced in an era where any mistake could be your last. Today, of course, I'm talking about the legend that is Niki Lauda. Niki Lauda was born on the 22nd of February 1949 to a family of wealthy industrialists in Vienna, Austria. Throughout his childhood, his family wanted him to become a wealthy businessman like the rest of the family, but instead the young Lauda began an interest in racing and, more importantly, Formula 1. His family hated his passion in motorsport. They wanted him to keep with the family tradition of going into business, but Lauda refused. His grandfather, Hans Lauda, was particularly angry with Niki's ambitions, telling him a Lauda should be on the economic pages of the newspaper, not the sports pages. However, by the end of the 60s, Lauda had become set on open-wheel racing, and in 1969 he went against his family's wishes and began his endeavour in the Formula V Championship. Not much is known about what happened during that year, but Lauda apparently performed pretty well, winning 2 races throughout the year. This would be enough to propel him to a seat in Formula 3 for the 1970 season, and it would also be the first time Lauda would encounter his soon-to-be rival, James Hunt. By this point, him and his family had grown far apart from each other, and Lauda was fully committed with his motor racing endeavours. He had almost reached his goal of getting all the way to Formula 1. The only thing still in his path was the European Formula 2 Championship. At the end of 1970, using his insane family wealth, he secured a £30,000 loan to secure a seat for March Engineering in the European Formula 2 Championship for the 1971 season. 1971 wasn't a particularly good year for Lauda. In fact, it was awful. He only got points in 3 races and ended up down in 10th come the end of the season. His 1971 Formula 2 campaign with March wasn't great, but despite such a bad season in F2, something special did come out of 1971. You see, March raced as both a team in Formula 1 and Formula 2, and at the 1971 Austrian Grand Prix, Lauda would finally be given a one-off shot for glory in Formula 1. The race began with Joe Siffer on pole position, closely followed by Jackie Stewart, with Niki Lauda starting his debut race from 21st on the grid. Lauda's race was going well until on lap 20 his March 711 suffered handling problems, forcing him to retire from his first Grand Prix. This would be Lauda's first experience driving a Formula 1 car, and it was the only time March let him race in F1 in 1971. The next year, Lauda's dream would finally come true. March gave him a full-time seat for the 1972 Formula 1 World Championship. Crazily enough, however, even though he was due to race for March in Formula 1, he was still under contract to race for March in Formula 2 as well, meaning he was racing in both F1 and F2 at the same time. I'll briefly go over his 1972 Formula 2 season first. This year was a massive improvement from 1971. He got his best result of 2nd at the opening race at Mallory Park, and would go on to finish the season in 5th. Meanwhile, in F1, Lauda didn't score any points throughout the 1972 season, with a best result of 7th place at the South African Grand Prix at Kyalami. Although Lauda's first full year in F1 wasn't particularly incredible, he stayed determined to carry on his ventures into F1 and took out another loan to become a paid driver at BRM for 1973. At BRM he had 2 new teammates who were both race winners with much more experience than Lauda, Clay Regazzoni and Jean-Pierre Beltois. Lauda's 1973 season at BRM allowed him to show the world his potential, and it was at this point where people started to realise just how incredibly fast Niki Lauda was. Throughout the season, Lauda would also go on to score his first ever points finish in F1 with an impressive 5th place at Zolder for the Belgian Grand Prix. Things were looking up for Lauda, and by the end of the year, Lauda's teammate Clay Regazzoni was given a place at Ferrari for the 1974 season. However, Ferrari was still short of a second driver, so they asked Regazzoni what he thought of Niki Lauda. Ferrari started to take interest in Lauda after Regazzoni apparently spoke so highly of him and praised him so much to the point that Ferrari signed Lauda to a full-time seat for the 1974 Formula 1 season. After 2 years of driving in the midfield, this was finally it. Lauda was given the opportunity to prove his capabilities by fighting for race wins at none other than Ferrari. The first race of the 1974 season was the Argentine Grand Prix at Buenos Aires, with Ronnie Peterson starting on pole, followed by Regazzoni starting in second and Lauda starting down in 8th. The race begins and carnage breaks out, with multiple crashes across the pack and the likes of James Hunt and Clay Regazzoni spinning on the opening lap. Lauda stayed clear of all the first lap chaos, and by lap 27 Jackie Ickx came into the pits after a puncture, putting Lauda up into third behind Denny Hulme and Carlos Reutemann. All was looking well for Carlos Reutemann to win the Grand Prix until an engine issue caused him to lose the lead to Denny Hulme and eventually drop out the points completely. The race ended with Denny Hulme taking the victory and Lauda taking his first podium of his career with an incredible second place, followed by teammate Regazzoni in third. This put Ferrari second in the championship, just behind McLaren, and after this Lauda and Ferrari became one of the greatest relationships in Formula 1 history. After this opening race, Lauda wouldn't be so fortunate in the next couple races, retiring at Interlagos, and would suffer an ignition failure at Kyalami after starting from pole position. This bad luck was only temporary, however, as in the next race in Spain, Lauda would produce one of the most memorable drives of his career. The 1974 Spanish Grand Prix at Jarama started with Niki Lauda on pole position, followed by Ronnie Peterson in a close second. As rain started to fall on the circuit, the race began with Peterson overtaking Lauda off the line, but later on in the race the track started to dry, with Ferrari being quick to respond and calling Lauda into the pits. After a 35-second tyre change pit stop, which was pretty quick at the time, Lauda found himself comfortably leading the race ahead of teammate Regazzoni behind him. The race ended on lap 84, with Lauda taking home his first victory in Formula 1 and Regazzoni making it a Ferrari 1-2 finish. After this first win, it's fair to say Lauda's confidence improved, and over the rest of the 1974 season, Lauda took 3 more podiums, including 1 more race win at Zandvoort. Niki Lauda would go on to finish the championship in 4th, behind Jody Scheckter, Clay Regazzoni and the 1974 champion Emerson Fittipaldi. Also in the Constructors' Championship, Lauda and Regazzoni got Ferrari to 2nd, just behind McLaren. The next year, Regazzoni and Lauda stayed as teammates at Ferrari for the 1975 season, with a brand new car fit with the infamous massive airboxes that all the cars had that year. The start of Ferrari's 1975 season wasn't great, with them stuck down in 4th in the Constructors after the first 4 races of the season, and Lauda was stuck all the way down in 7th. This would soon change, however, as at the 5th race of the season at Monaco, Lauda produced one of the greatest drives of his F1 career. The grid was left with a somber atmosphere after a crash at the previous Grand Prix in Spain tragically killed 5 spectators. Lauda knows that if he wants to become world champion, he'll have to get a good result in this race after his awful start to the season. The race begins with Lauda on pole position, and he quickly gets away from the rest of the pack to create an early lead between him and the rest of the field. Behind him, the wet weather caused second place Jean-Pierre Jarier to crash, increasing the gap between Lauda and everyone else even more. As the laps went on, more and more people started to retire, with the likes of Clay Regazzoni, James Hunt and Mario Andretti among them. Lauda was having a comfortable lead over the rest of the field until suddenly his car developed an oil pressure issue with just a couple laps left to go before the end of the race. Second place Emerson Fittipaldi was now chasing down Lauda's damaged car, but Lauda pushed forward and managed to win the race by a mere 2.7 seconds. This fantastic win boosted Lauda all the way from 7th to 3rd in the championship, just behind the two Brazilians of Carlos Pache and Emerson Fittipaldi. This win allowed Lauda to regain his confidence that many thought he'd lost, and after this race his season only got better and better. The next time out at the Belgian Grand Prix at Zolder, Lauda would once again win the race to boost him from 3rd to 1st in the championship by a mere 2 points from the reigning world champion Emerson Fittipaldi. In the next couple rounds after that, he would go on to win in Sweden, come 2nd in Holland and win again in France, so that by round 10 at Silverstone he was a massive 22 points ahead of everyone else. As the races went on, Lauda scored 3rd at the Nürburgring, 6th at the Österreichring and 3rd at Monza, which was enough to clinch the world title with one race to spare. Lauda had finally done it. After leaving his family in pursuit of a career in motorsport, his work had finally paid off. Niki Lauda was the 1975 Formula 1 World Champion. After Lauda clinched the title, he will once again win the final race of the season at Watkins Glen to finish 20 points ahead of the competition and put Ferrari as the Constructors' Champions. Now, after the 1975 season ended, little did anyone know that the next year would become, in my opinion, the most legendary season in F1's history. If you're watching this video, there's a good chance you already know about the insane story of the 1976 season with James Hunt and Niki Lauda, and if you don't, well, let's begin. For the 1976 season, Lauda and Regazzoni remained at Ferrari. Meanwhile at McLaren, Emerson Fittipaldi left and was replaced by James Hunt, partnered with Jochen Mass. The season begins at the Brazilian Grand Prix with James Hunt on pole position with Lauda starting 2nd. Throughout the race, Hunt develops throttle issues, forcing him to retire and giving the win to Lauda, putting him 1st in the championship straight away. The next time out at Kyalami, Lauda would once again win the race from James Hunt in 2nd, again giving Lauda a huge lead over the rest of the field. The next race at Long Beach would once again work in Lauda's favour, with him finishing 2nd with Hunt retiring due to an accident on the 3rd lap. By this point it seemed clear Lauda was once again going to dominate and become world champion. After only 3 races he was a massive 14 points ahead of everyone else. The next time out for the Spanish Grand Prix saw James Hunt win the race with Niki Lauda in 2nd, until after the race officials examined Hunt's McLaren and realised it was a couple millimetres too wide, disqualifying Hunt and giving Lauda yet another win to get him closer to his 2nd world title. After this controversy, Lauda would carry on dominating by winning in Belgium and Monaco, and after James Hunt was disqualified at Brands Hatch, he inherited that win as well. As the races went on, even though it seemed like Lauda was leagues ahead of everyone else, it was apparent James Hunt was slowly but surely catching up to him. Hunt had won the French Grand Prix after Lauda suffered an engine failure, and McLaren managed to appeal Hunt's disqualification at the Spanish Grand Prix to reinstate him as the winner. By the German Grand Prix at the Nürburgring, it was clear that if anyone was going to challenge Lauda for the championship, it was James Hunt. Before the race began, Lauda arranged a boycott to cancel the race as he was unhappy with the insane danger of the Nürburgring, especially considering it was forecast to rain when the race began. However, the other drivers voted a majority against the planned boycott just by one single vote, which would prove to be a fateful decision. As predicted, the rain did start to fall on the starting grid, so both Lauda and Hunt decided to start the race on full wet tyres, thinking the rain would be present for a long time. The race began with Lauda chasing Hunt through the 16-mile-long circuit, but on the first lap it became apparent immediately that the rain was ending and the wet tyres would become completely useless. At the end of the lap, both Lauda and Hunt pitted for new slick tyres, with Lauda now in hot pursuit of Hunt ahead of him. It was at this point where the most pivotal moment of Lauda's whole career and whole life would occur. Just after Bergwick Corner, Lauda's car would suddenly spear off the track and crash into a guardrail, causing him to bounce back onto the track while engulfed in flames. Lauda was trapped in the inferno as fellow drivers Guy Edwards, Brett Lunger and Harold Ertel all got out of their cars in an attempt to save him while they waited for medics to arrive at the scene. Thankfully, Lauda was eventually saved from the car after suffering severe burns and was immediately rushed off to hospital. After this accident, many were convinced Lauda was going to die. He was administered the last rites by a priest in hospital, and Ferrari had already hired a replacement in Carlos Reutemann. While Lauda continued to fight for his life in hospital, James Hunt slowly started to close the gap between himself and Lauda during his absence. And after the Dutch Grand Prix, Hunt was only a mere 2 points behind leading the championship. It was believed it would be months or even years before Lauda would ever return to racing. But no, Lauda made his triumphant return only 6 weeks after his near-fatal crash at the Nürburgring.
Der amtierende Weltmeister Niki Lauda.
With fresh blood still under his bandages, Lauda, against all odds, returned to Formula 1 at the 1976 Italian Grand Prix at Monza. Many years later, Lauda would go on to admit that he was absolutely terrified, but regardless, he entered the race after qualifying in 5th. The race began and Lauda got a poor start, falling all the way down the pack, but gradually he began to regain his speed and fight his way to the front. Despite his short break from F1, Lauda was able to carry on fighting position after position. All was looking well for Lauda, and on lap 11 Hunt span out and retired from the race, widening the gap between him and Lauda in the championship. Niki Lauda would go on to finish an incredible 4th place, proving to the world that despite his injuries, his speed was still very much intact. After his incredible comeback at the Italian Grand Prix, the next 2 races wouldn't go as smoothly for him. Hunt ended up winning both races, with Lauda placing 3rd in the US and down in 8th in Canada. Coming into the last race of the season, the Japanese Grand Prix at Fuji, Lauda was only 3 points ahead of Hunt. The championship would be decided at this race. The track was soaked with rain, and similarly to the German Grand Prix, there was many debates over whether the race should go ahead at all. This time, a majority of drivers, including both Hunt and Lauda, voted to cancel the race, but race officials decided for the grand finale of the 1976 season to go ahead anyway. The race begins with Hunt taking the lead straight away, with Lauda chasing him down to keep his title as the reigning world champion. After the first couple laps, it became apparent how appalling the conditions were. Drivers were completely blinded by water from the cars in front, and it was almost impossible to steer the car through such a flooded track. On lap 2 of the race, Lauda suddenly went into the pits and surprisingly chose to retire from the race due to it being too dangerous. When asked about why he did this, he would later go on to say, "My life is worth more than a title." With Lauda now out of the race and out of the World Championship, Hunt would have to finish 3rd place or higher to become the new world champion. Hunt carried on fighting in the awful weather, and by the final stages of the Grand Prix, Hunt found himself in 5th place with only 4 laps to go. In the closing stages of the race, with just a couple laps to go, Hunt successfully overtook both Alan Jones and Clay Regazzoni to finish the race in 3rd. This result meant James Hunt became the 1976 Formula 1 World Champion by just 1 single point, wrapping up one of the most dramatic seasons in F1's history. With all the drama of 1976 over, the 1977 season approached, with Lauda paired with new teammate Carlos Reutemann, and the season would prove to be much less dramatic than the previous year. For the first 8 races, the season was led by the South African Jody Scheckter, with Lauda following behind in a close second. At the French Grand Prix, however, a retirement from Scheckter allowed Lauda to take 1st place in the championship, just a single point ahead of him. This 1-point differential would soon get bigger, however, as Lauda began to dominate the second half of the season. Lauda went on to come 4th at Watkins Glen, 2nd at Silverstone Monza and the Oostenrijkring, and would win at Hockenheim and Zandvoort. The season went from just 1 point between 1st and 2nd in race 9 to a massive 25 points by race 15. And to put that into perspective, winning a race back then would only award you 9 points. At the United States Grand Prix, Lauda managed to clinch the title with 2 races to go and become the 1977 World Champion, and also making him a double World Champion. As he had already clinched the title, Lauda simply just didn't turn up for the final 2 races of the year, after he announced he was leaving Ferrari and moving to the Brabham team for the 1978 season. Lauda would go on to race for Brabham in 1978 with teammate John Watson, and in 1979 with future world champion Nelson Piquet. Lauda did incredibly well in the 1978 season, claiming 7 podiums and 2 wins, including the 1978 Swedish Grand Prix with the infamous Brabham BT46B, otherwise known as the fan car. If you don't know about this car, check out my video from a couple months ago, I'll leave it in the description. Anyway, Lauda finished the 1978 season in a solid 4th behind Carlos Reutemann, Ronnie Peterson and the world champion Mario Andretti. However, for the 1979 season, Lauda wouldn't be so fortunate due to how hideously unreliable the 1977 Brabham was. Lauda would finish the season stuck all the way down in 14th. Throughout the year, he only finished 2 of the 13 races, with a 6th place finish at Kyalami and a 4th place finish at Monza. After an incredibly disappointing season with 2 races left to go, Lauda abruptly announced he was retiring from F1 altogether, saying he didn't want to continue the silliness of driving around in circles. This obviously came as a massive shock to everyone at the time, but little did they know he would come back just a few years later. Niki Lauda made his return to F1 in 1982, now racing for McLaren, and because it had been 4 years since Lauda had last drove an F1 car, people didn't know if he still had the same speed that made him a double world champion. This was later disproved, however, as on his 3rd race back, Lauda would win the United States Grand Prix, already putting him 2nd in the championship. But sadly, this was overshadowed by the fact that the 1982 season was one of the darkest years in F1's history. I might make a separate video about 1982 sometime in the future, but basically it saw the tragic deaths of drivers Gilles Villeneuve, Riccardo Paletti, and the near fatal crash of Didier Pironi. Anyway, Lauda would stay at McLaren for the 1983 season, with his new teammate being the up-and-coming Alain Prost. The season began with a fantastic start, with Lauda coming 3rd and 2nd at the opening 2 races of the season to immediately boost him to 1st in the championship. This wouldn't last long, however, as throughout the rest of the season, Lauda would only go on to finish in the points 2 more times, with a 6th place finish in the UK and Austria. Because of this, despite leading the championship after 2 races, Lauda ended the 1983 season in a disappointing 10th place. In 1984, Lauda and Prost remained at McLaren, and this year would finally be the return to form for Lauda that so many people have waited for. Lauda began the season with 2 wins in France and Austria, so that by the Monaco Grand Prix, Lauda was 2nd in the championship. However, it still was a fairly large 10-point gap between him and championship leader Alain Prost. Over the next couple of races, a mixture of poor results from Prost and great driving from Lauda let him slowly edge closer to leading the World Championship. At the 1984 Austrian Grand Prix, a win from Lauda and a retirement from Prost would finally put Lauda as the championship leader for the first time in the season. As the season continued, Lauda would stay strong with a 4th place finish in Germany, a 2nd place finish in Holland and a win in Italy. Going into the final race, Lauda was only 3.5 points ahead of teammate Alain Prost. The 1984 World Championship would be decided at Estoril for the 1984 Portuguese Grand Prix. A disappointing qualifying saw Lauda starting 11th on the grid, with championship rival Alain Prost starting in 2nd. The race began and Lauda immediately started his pursuit to climb up the field, while Alain Prost found himself overtaking Nelson Piquet to lead the race. As the laps went by, Lauda kept on getting closer and closer to Prost, and with 14 laps to go, Lauda found himself in 3rd place, which would not be enough to secure the championship. Luck was on Lauda's side though, as 2nd place Nigel Mansell suffered a brake failure, forcing him to retire from the race and putting Lauda in second just behind Alain Prost. As the race was coming to an end, Lauda knew he would have to hold on to second place to the checkered flag, because even if Prost won the race, second place would still be just enough to win the championship. Lauda carried on fighting and miraculously managed to hold on and finish in second place, winning him the championship by the smallest margin in F1 history, just half a point. 1975, 1977, 1984. Lauda had become a triple world champion, and to this day he is the only person to have become champion with the two most successful teams, Ferrari and McLaren. The next year, in 1985, Lauda wouldn't have as great a season as last year, finishing the season in 10th, with a single podium being a win at the Dutch Grand Prix. Meanwhile, his teammate Alain Prost would dominate the season and become the 1985 world champion by a massive 20-point margin. Lauda's win at the 1985 Dutch Grand Prix would prove to be his last, as at the end of the season, Lauda announced he was retiring from F1 for good. Outside of F1, Niki Lauda was an aviation entrepreneur, and after he retired from F1, he began to focus on his airline, Lauda Air, from 1986 all the way to 2013. After this, Lauda would most prominently go on to become non-executive chairman of Mercedes-AMG F1 team from 2012 to 2019, helping both Lewis Hamilton and Nico Rosberg become world champions. However, in 2018, Lauda was suffering from bad health problems, and in August 2018, Lauda had to undergo a lung transplant, which ended in success. It was clear Lauda's health was deteriorating, and sadly, on the 20th of May 2019, Niki Lauda passed away in his sleep, aged 70, ending one of the greatest legacies in F1's history. Throughout his career, Lauda won the World Championship 3 times and claimed 25 race wins. He is a symbol of determination, not just in F1 but life in general. His comeback from the near-fatal crash at the Nürburgring that changed his life is truly inspirational. He really was faster than death.